Magic is incredibly powerful in D&D styled worlds. One of the key issues is that it's very difficult to stop. A well-prepared caster in ideal conditions can take on an entire army and emerge victorious. And magic can solve real-world problems that even we don't have viable solutions for yet. With the overwhelming strength of magic in warfare, defense, commerce, and construction, there will certainly have been people who have tried to limit the power of magic. Today, we're looking at ways to counter a spellcaster with almost no investment, magically or financially, on our end. First, let's look at what it actually takes to cast a spell. A caster is required to use verbal, somatic, or material components, or some combination thereof, in order to make magic work. Therefore, a caster needs to be able to speak, and needs to have at least one hand free for the gathering of components and making of gestures. With spells like compulsion, hypnotic pattern, and suggestion, a requirement is needed on the target's side. The target either needs to be able to hear the spell being cast, or to see the actual spell's effect for any effect to take place. Other popular limitations on spells include the caster themselves having to see a target or see a location in which they are placing the spell's radius. Some spells have other niche requirements, such as the presence of certain materials like dirt or stone, or the presence of plants. So in short, casting a spell requires a certain number of things to go right. So the job of any anti-mage infantry or group is to ensure that some of these things don't. If any spellcaster is in your custody, hands should be bound to such an extent that finger dexterity is limited or non-existent. Possessions should be confiscated, especially anything that could be an arcane focus, a spellbook, a component pouch, or any sort of thing of that kind. And prisoner spellcasters should be gagged, really, or prevented from speaking in some other way. Spellcasting prisoners need to be fed by hand by a trained guardsman who is ready to slap a hand over their mouth, or perhaps through a straw, requiring mouth movements to be limited to just a pursed lip shape through which most speaking sounds cannot be made. But this is the easy part. We're assuming that you've already got the spellcaster in your custody. No, the real challenge is besting one in the field. And here's how. First, most enchantment spells can be countered using earplugs. Hear me out. Compulsion, suggestion, and vicious mockery all state that the target must be able to hear the caster for the spell to have any effect at all. But there are some speaking-based enchantment spells, like Command, that are arguable as to whether they work, even though the target has purposefully deafened himself. The only stipulations on this spell are that the target cannot be undead, they must understand your language, and they can't follow directly harmful commands. Technically, for our purposes then, the only really useful requirements are that the caster must see the target, and that the target must understand what language the caster is speaking in. This means that the target doesn't need to be able to hear the command to follow it. They just need to understand the language being used, which seems strange. I would argue, however, that a spoken language cannot be reasonably understood without audio feedback, and as such, I would also allow command to be countered by stuffing one's ears with cotton wool. Some pretty high-level enchantment magic also has similar wordings to command, which, in this case, I would allow the stuffing of cotton wool and deafening of oneself to counteract their requirements. These are Geas, which is pretty strong, and Modify Memory, which requires the caster to describe the new memories that the target should be forming. If you can't hear them describing it, how on earth are you going to form anything new? The deployment of flesh-coloured earplugs that are going to be pushed deep inside the ear, partly to avoid them falling out during a fight and partly to avoid them being spotted by an eagle-eyed enchanter, are a must before heading into the lair of any person who can use enchantment magic. Yes, not being able to hear is a slight weakness, but with a well-coordinated group, you could probably use some sort of hand signal to compensate for the lack of communication during combat, and hope that the context clues can give you enough information to avoid blows coming from most directions. Speaking of groups, it seems to me that incorporating just a couple of hidden, secret, disguised undead into your anti-magic strike team is a brilliant idea. Many enchantment spells fail automatically on them, as do spells like Hold Person or Dominate Person. So if you're willing to add some disguised undead to your ranks, you may find that a spellcaster may waste their entire turn on a spell that literally cannot affect them. On the other hand, if you disguise yourself as an undead, perhaps shambling or perhaps using some sort of makeup or illusions, a mage might spend the entire combat avoiding targeting you with certain spells, just based on that simple deception. The best method for this is probably to find some souls who have been harmed by that mage's or caster's actions, and perhaps coerce or perhaps convince or perhaps magically force them to return as some sort of revenant. Using official rules, this could be the Hollow One supernatural gift from Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. This gives you the undead creature type as a regular bonus to your normal species. Now, I am aware that this is supposed to be non-magic ways of dealing with spellcasters, but convincing a spellcaster that some or all of your group may be undead is a really good way to avoid them using those really quite potent crowd control and enchantment spells more generally, which can be a huge boon. And it could be achieved with makeup or some decent acting as you approach. Groups training to defeat mages may also train to recognize the signs of spellcasting. I would give such individuals a reaction to potentially observe what spell is being cast and react accordingly, of course, if their reaction is available and they have trained with this specific spell before. A good practical example of this is with Hypnotic Pattern. Mage Slayers may have trained very, very hard to recognize this particular spell above all others by hand gestures alone. Not to mention the glow stick or glowing vial incorporated into the casting as a material component. And they would probably have trained well enough to use their reaction to close their eyes. As Hypnotic Pattern appears and disappears instantaneously after making its effect known, this could be an incredibly potent countermeasure to this spell specifically. Particularly savvy casters who've been around the block and may have seen this trick before, however, may hide secondary spells components in their sleeves and use these instead, using the Hypnotic Pattern as a bluff to cast a direct attacking spell using a spell attack roll, which would be given advantage if your enemies have all just closed their eyes. This could lead to something of an arms race of bluffs and double bluffs, which could be an incredibly entertaining state to see a world in. This practice of learning to observe specific spell components and gestures could also be incredibly useful when going up against illusion magic. Perhaps trained mage slayers have advantage on seeing through illusions if they can see the caster actually casting them and know what spell is coming. Mage slayers like this might also be very savvy of which spells can be countered by simply waking your allies up with a slap, and what spread they're required to be at when facing down a magical enemy. What is the most efficient skirmishing spread you can have, distance from your allies, to ensure that area of effect spells are limited in power. They might also understand some of the requirements of concentration. It turns out hitting an enemy multiple times with smaller attacks is much more efficient at trying to get them to break concentration than hitting them once with a big hit. If this seems a bit metagamey in trying to get the caster as many opportunities to roll a 1 as possible, there are in-world explanations for this as well. This could be born from experience or simple common sense, that the more slings and arrows a spellcaster suffers, the less easy it is for them to focus on just one thing, just one concentrated spell. But all these so far are ways to survive for a time against a spellcaster's onslaught of mostly area of effect spells. They're not decisive. The annoying thing about your enemy having magic is that they can switch from a suite of spells designed to disable vast groups of people to a devastating bomb on one individual or multiple to an incredible escape option. Now, once we've got past some of the more subtle and long-range tricks that casters can use, we're into their bread and butter. Fireballs, flying, invisibility, and teleporting away. These are some of the most common spells in regular use for good reason. Fireball, lightning bolt, and spells like them are fairly good simply because they're reasonably damage efficient, especially at middling levels where most of these encounters will happen. But fly, invisibility, and teleportation magic are simply strictly better than anything we can muster even in our modern world. It's no small wonder then that they're incredibly popular and potent spells in D&D settings. So how do we stop our mages, first, from getting away? Boasting verbal, somatic, and material components, Fly is actually a pretty easy spell to see coming. Unlike Hypnotic Pattern even, you can just learn to tune into the verbal cue of it being cast, the specific magic words that must be said to know exactly that someone's about to start flying. Countering Fly is very similar to countering Polymorph. First, if the caster is using it on themselves to survive, you've already won. A caster should almost never use spells like this on themselves, specifically in combat, due to the concentration problem. Sooner or later, if you keep getting hit, you will eventually roll a 1. Groups of mage slayers should have an auxiliary force, or perhaps just a lot of members, in standby, watching or listening for that concentration spell to go up. Immediately, en masse, a hail of arrows or stones or something to try and distract these particular mages from the magic they have just cast. The cumulative DC from doing over 20 damage in one hit and ramping up is laughable, frankly, for making concentration checks more difficult than the regular DC 10 that happens on every hit that does less than 20 damage. So really, your absolute best bet is getting multiple relatively unskilled people and having them hammer as many times as possible on the mage's defenses. First and foremost, you're looking to break concentration, which, unless your spellcasting enemy has specifically Warcaster, which is the best feat for avoiding these kinds of situations in the game, by the way, the damage from 20 or so shots are still going to really add up, even if the mage is casting shield to protect themselves from some of these hits. But of course, prevention is far more useful than countering a spell that has already been cast. But how is it possible to stop a spell from being cast without access to anti-magic or counterspell? We make the spellcasting conditions impossible. For some bizarre reason, mages love to live in small, spindly little towers or in tiny little enclosed huts, brewing away at their potions, or in caves, or doing some sort of enclosed space. And this is the worst possible place they can be. It is of course an excellent idea to place yourself in somewhere with a lot of sharp corners, a lot of angles that you can't necessarily see past, or in a small enclosure that doesn't allow you to see everywhere around you. A shocking amount of spells require sight on your target, so placing yourself at the very top of an enclosed spiral staircase, which notoriously you can't see very far down, is a horrific idea for any sort of reasonable defense. Especially if you've got a cluttered bedroom or a laboratory filled with all sorts of stuff and junk. Mages are often described as hoarders. It generally gives you absolutely no benefit of the massive benefit of having spells. Spellcasters have excellent range, excellent mobility options if they can use them, and an excellent ability to forecast threats that are coming. Putting yourself in an enclosed small room is the exact way that you counteract every single one of those things. Mages should live in grand, open, echoing halls with a bed perhaps just in the very centre, or maybe, sleep in a Learman's tiny hut if you have access to that spell. Or, just outside? Because this actually gives them a chance to use some of their spells before unfortunately and tragically ending their life in a dingy dungeon somewhere. Much like you can catch an invisible person by throwing flour everywhere in the hopes of spotting their outline. You won't know who it is, but you'll at least know there's someone invisible there. Mundane caster catchers should be going after any reasonably mundane animal that they can see in the area when they're on a mission. Oh, it's just a rat. Doesn't fly anymore, when that rat could be shooting fireballs out of its eyes in the next few seconds as a wizard's familiar, for example. Or, just be a druid escaping the scene before you get there. Unfortunately, the only policy one can take towards cute and fluffy animals and the rest of the creatures in the vicinity of a mage is ruthless efficiency. From spiders to rats, it could be critical in surviving the encounter and winning the day. But none of this actually stops spellcasting in its tracks. What is our secret weapon? Well, it's already been mentioned. Flower. Specifically, the humble flower bomb. Every teleportation spell in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition except Steel Wind Strike requires a verbal component. And that means that the caster, unless they're a sorcerer specifically with subtle spell, must open their mouth and speak the magic words to get any effect out of their magic. Especially if the caster is in some enclosed small room, any caster catching team worth its salt would have a selection of slingers on standby, each ready to hurl a flower bomb straight into the face of any spellcaster who attempts a spell with a verbal component. At least the first time a spellcaster is exposed to this, it's going to be incredibly disorientating. Pelted with bag upon bag of flour, the roof of your mouth coated with dryness, unable to produce saliva, unable to say any word that isn't cough. The first time it may even blind you if you have your eyes open and aren't expecting it, cutting off the two most important aspects of spellcasting: speaking and seeing. It is possible that spellcasters get used to this, open their mouths early to bluff slingers into sending a bunch of early powder so that they can then cast their spells, but they're still going to find that they're surrounded by a cloud of flour, which is going to be pretty difficult to see through, at least light obscurement. Furthermore, the dust generated by flour is incredibly flammable and incredibly explosion prone. Even a preemptive coating of flour hanging in the air may be a little too risky for a mage to begin casting, say, Burning Hands, or even a fireball. Considering that a bright streak flashes from your pointing finger, this may be a little too close for comfort in creating any sort of spark or flammable area around yourself, creating a secondary fireball immediately centered on you. This may be a little too real-world physicsy, though, considering that it is magic and magical fire, and the fireball part of the fire, anything that deals fire damage, really only exists once the bead has hit its specific point in space and gone boom. What I will stress though, is that it's probably quite hard to get your words out even with just a cloud of flour hanging around you and flour all over your face. But why stop there? Perhaps instead of flour, some enterprising spellcatchers will start using powdered chili peppers or mace. They are rare spices, yes, but if they get in your eyes, your throat, your mouth, they are incredibly detrimental to one's ability to speak, see, and even think. I'm not sure any mage is in a state to fight with a face filled with oil and capsaicin, you know, the basic ingredients for pepper spray. In essence then, if a mage lets any fighter, especially one with a sling filled with something to throw at them, within, let's say 30 feet, the fight is over, especially because all of these slingers will be preparing their actions on their turn to get something in that mage's face as fast as possible. And they'll be spread out, so there's no real way to get all of them at once. The fight is seriously over, no hyperbole. Every bag of flour or capsaicin or other horrific spice that is pelting this poor caster is also going to be doing damage at some point, maybe just one damage, but that all adds up in helping break concentration on any spell that was already active. It's a horrible, horrible time for any mage, and I'm not sure anyone's going to be in fighting condition after that. This all does mean that actually Air Bubble, which is a little used spell from the Spelljammer collection for 5th edition, might actually become the most potent tool a mage has in their arsenal for dealing with exactly this sort of thing. It may be so that a mage tries to cast it almost every single day, just in preparation for a face full of, essentially, pepper spray. But the best thing about chucking a bunch of powder onto a mage is that it actually emulates some very interesting real-world cultural practices, like the really famous Holi festival in India, where coloured powders are thrown at participants to ward off evil spirits. And it even reflects modern protest practices like flowering or egging particularly unpleasant politicians, for example, which happens really all over the world in various different forms. Perhaps if your leaders are mages, a good flowering is not just an insult, but a threat to life. It could be the start of an assassination attempt. It would be taken perhaps very seriously indeed, even for non-magic users, because of its history in creating the space for an opportunity to strike. But there you have it. A squad trained in a specific way to perfectly counteract and take out spellcasters. Except sorcerers. Screw sorcerers, I mean, bloody subtle spell. Anyway, this might actually make sorcerers a pretty strong class in being able to survive these sorts of attempts, and might increase the development of research on how to stop a sorcerer. It would be cool to see a world where sorcerers are actually, you know, unique, interesting, and powerful. Sorry, sorcerer fans, but one meta magic feature makes much of this video pretty much obsolete, which is quite irritating. But that's life. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed, I hope you've learned something or begun to think about D&D, spellcasting and world building in a slightly different way. And if you'd like more videos on how to deal with mages, then I'm sure I could oblige. I do give magic users a very favourable opinion on the world building effects of their presence in D&D styled worlds, because, well, they should really have. Magic is incredibly powerful. It does things that we humans even cannot today. But yeah, some anti-magic things might be good every once in a while too. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.